of different objects. And now what we're going to do is we're going to look at how we can use it to save our road from falling apart and coming out of sync. And to do this, the first thing that I want you to do is I want you to title all of your tiles the way I have them titled here. Now, these names aren't going to change anything about how this is working, but it's just going to make it a lot easier for you to visually track what's happening as we write the code and as we create the graph and we start testing it. Right? So you want this road tile 0, and make sure there's a space in each of these, just because then when we go to start adding them, they align in the right order when we add them to these objects. Okay, so the first step that we're going to take is, right, we've got our code here that's updating the position of the tiles, right? That's going through and, right, updates the speed and everything like that. And we want to do this, but we're going to want to do this someplace else. The other thing we've got is our trigger here on the tile trigger. And honestly, I can't remember if we need to adjust that. But the one thing we do need to set is we're definitely going to want to change is this section here, right? Because when we hit the trigger, it updates the position and shoots it all the way over. And so to start with, what we're going to do is what I'd like to do is create a new script. And this is what it's going to look like eventually when we get completed, right? We're going to be initializing all of our tile positions, then we're going to be updating all of our tile positions, and then we're going to be doing the work to reset the positions. And we're going to talk about what that means and why we're doing the things that we're doing. But to start with, we're going to be working on this initialize the road tile position. Now, I currently have this flow machine turned off, which is fantastic because that's what I want. But this is just my example, and we're going to go through and make this happen. So what we need to do first is let's go ahead and turn off the script for all of these tiles. So because these are all clones, right? These are copies of a prefab. I'm just going to hold down Shift and select all of them. And I'm going to go down to the flow machine and I'm going to uncheck it. And what that means is that right now the flow machine should be turned off on all of these copies, because we don't want any of this to happen on the per tile any longer. We're going to be controlling this with the parent road tiles. Right? So I'm going to go ahead and select road tiles, and I'm going to create a new graph. So I'm going to go to flow machine, and I'm going to make it an embed. Now, the reason I'm making it an embed is because I want to be able to use this object and the prefabs as well, because these are specific copies, specific instances of the prefab, which would not be accessible to me if I did this as a macro. And so in order to get this to work, this needs to be an embed. Right? So I have it set to embed. I'm going to change this title to tile control. And if I click edit graph, that makes sure I'm in the right graph. And so the first thing I'm going to want to do, I'm going to leave update here because eventually we're probably going to use it. But the first thing I want to do is I want to be able to initialize the position of these tiles and initialize all of the tiles themselves. Now, we've already just dragged and dropped these in there and set them in place. But we're going to do this with code because it's going to also help us to understand what a collection is and how we can use it and how we can use for loops to use these things. So the first thing we're going to need to do is create a graph variable that's going to be a collection of these objects. Now, we haven't used these yet, and we're going to talk a bit about what this is. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to call this, give this a name, and then we're going to call it tile list. All right, so I've named it tile list. I'm going to hit the plus sign, and now I need to choose the type. Now the type doesn't show up in this general thing, right? Because just because the way it is. What we need to do is we need a list is the type, L-I-S-T. And then you'll note that there's all sorts of different lists. And each one has, we don't want tile, even though you think we might. Each one has a word in here. Some of these we might recognize. Bool is like a true or false, right? Font is a list of fonts. If we scroll down, you can see there's a lot of other options in here. But so what we want is game object. And the way lists are set up when you program them is you need an opening, right, symbol like this. And then I'm just going to type in GAME. And I'm going to go back up to the top of my list there because I had scrolled down a bit. And I need this list game object. And now what that does is it creates this empty list where I can insert multiple different game objects. So I have essentially one unit that I can use to access as many game objects as I need to access, right? And so what I want is I want to be able to access all of these game objects. And so I'm going to use the plus sign, and I'm going to start with objects with 0, and I'm going to work my way up. So I'm going to go and click on here. And because, right, I'm using this as an embed, all these tiles are available to add. And so I'm going to say road tile 0. I'm going to close this. I'm going to hit plus, road tile 1. And I'll probably speed this section of the tutorial up, but go ahead and just keep adding tiles until you get all of them in there. Okay, so we should have road tiles 0 through 6 listed in our list. And so now I'm going to go ahead and click on that. I'm going to drag that list into my scene. And now, now this allows us to access the elements of this list, right? It's just like a normal variable. If I click here and then click again, it'll pop up some of the options. Now, where a list is a type of what's called a collection, and you can imagine, right, a collection is a collection of objects or a collection of floating point numbers or a collection of whatever you want it to be. You know, it's sort of like a hoarder. And so there's two types. There's dictionaries and there's lists. Dictionaries have something called a key, which is like a phrase or a value other than as a way to access certain things. In our case, we're just going to use lists. And lists, in order to access the different members of the list, you use an index value, right? And so if we look up here where we have our different values, and we have this 0 through 6, right? We have 7 members. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or sorry, we have 6 members. Where did I missed a member. I missed 2. Let me go ahead and add 2 and fix that. So if I forget somebody, like say unit 2, because we should have 7 members, not 6, what I can do is I can click on this and I can actually drag this up in the order. So if you missed one, make sure you have 0 through 6, and so there should be a total of 7. All right, so I have 7 options here. And the reason I named these this way and the reason I ordered these this way is that this number here, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, is the same as the index number for each of these entries as they are currently ordered. Right? So much like with the random number generator, with the for loop, everything else, we start counting at 0 and we end at 1 less than the total number of items that we have, right? So it's 0 through 6 instead of 1 through 7. So that's how I access these, is with this index. And since we've already looked at the for loop and how you essentially start with 0 and go to whatever, and it counts up one at a time, that means I can systematically go through and grab, the first object, make a change to it, grab the second object, make a change to it, grab the third object, make a change to it using a for loop. And so, and there's there's 2 different types of for loops that I talked about before. There's the normal for loop and there's for each. For this initialization, we're going to use the for each loop. And so if I come down here and I go down to control, I can go down to for each. And when I've done that, you'll see that it links directly to this this icon here, which is which is a list icon. Now, there is this checkbox for a dictionary. We're not using a dictionary, so we don't need to check that. But so the first thing we want to do is we want to grab our list, and we want to have our flow go. So when the game starts, this flow is going to come into here. And then this is very similar to the other for loop we used, right? Whatever we want to have happen to each one of the members of our list is going to be in the body. And if for some reason we want something to happen after that, then we can attach that to the exit. And you'll see that we have this item option and this index option here that come out, right? So those are two other things that we can grab out of there. And so the reason we don't have that, before we had the start and the finish and everything, what this loop does is it actually figures out what the length, how many members are in this list, and then it starts from 0 and it just goes to the max, to the last member. So it starts at 0 and goes to 6 in this case. And it just works its way through and gives us each one of the items so that we can do something to it. And what we want to do is we want to initialize the position. And so we know that these are, right, we want these to be spaced 10 units apart. And granted, we're putting them back exactly where they were, but this is just an example of the for each loop. So first, we want them all to be, right, 10 units apart. Second, right, this tile in the game is at 0. This one's at -10. And the furthest one away is at 50, right? So it goes -10, 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And that's where the positions are. And so we want to be able to do that. But our index is going to go from 0 to 6. So we're going to need to do some math to make that happen. So in the previous example, we already did the first part, which is to take our index and go to multiply, and then, right, set this from, instead of 1, make this a 10, right? So that if the index is 0, this is going to be 0. If it's 1, it'll be 10, and if it's 6, it'll be 60. So then, in order to shift those over so that we start at -10 and we end at 50 instead of ending at 60, you may have already figured it out. We're going to need to subtract 10 from whatever this is. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to click again, I'm going to go to subtract, and I'm going to say 10. Right? So this should say, so now if I'm thinking about this and I'm like, all right, so the first time through this loop, the index is going to be 0. So this is going to be 0. So then 0 minus 10 is -10. That means this tile, road tile 0, we're going to set the z to -10. The second time through the loop, this will be 1. So it's going to be 10. 10 minus 10 is 0. So that's right. And you can go through and continue to think about how that's set up. Okay, so we've got the math right for the position, but now we need to grab our item and end up setting that position appropriately, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click on the item. I'm going to come over here just somewhere off in space. We can clean this up later. I'm going to click again, and what I want to get is the transform, and specifically what I want to be doing is I want to set the local position. So we're going to go ahead and type in transform dot local, and then if I just do local p, right, what I'm going to want to do eventually is set that, right? And so we're going to go ahead and select this. Now, what's the difference between position and local position? Position is the position of the object in the entire world, right? So position is, it doesn't matter if it's a child of another object, we're setting it somewhere in the world, in world space. However, local position means that it's the position relative to the parent. And in this case, the parent object for all of these road tiles is this road tiles object that we've put them in. Right? And so what that means is relative to wherever we drag or move this road tiles object, it's always going to be centered on the x and y coordinates relative to the road tile, and then it'll be 50 units ahead of where that road tile is in the Z, right? This allows us a lot of freedom to be able to move this whole group around and have those positions move as, move together. So I'm going to go ahead and click set. Now, obviously, I'm going to need a vector 3 in order to do this, right? Our best friend, vector 3. So I'm going to just right click and say add unit and new vector 3 xyz, right? And in this case, x and y we want to be 0. So I'm going to run this body through here, continue my flow over here, and then the only thing I'm changing is z. And then I want to make sure, something I always forget to do is connect this to here. Okay, so when I do this, what's going to happen is, right, it's going to come in, we're going to start, it's going to grab the list, it's going to run through the list, and it's going to set the Z position of each member. So it's going to set, and then once it's done, something else can happen, which we don't really need to have happen right now. So I've set that up, but I want to make double sure that all of these, right, we shut the flow machine off on that. And this tile controller one that I've done before is already off. So I'm going to click edit graph on here again, just to make sure. Okay, so if I do this, if everything's right, these should be in exactly the same position they are now. If I messed up, that's not going to be the case. And I'm actually going to mess it up here in just a second, just so you can see that we are doing something. Okay, so one of the other things is I probably should have turned off all of these other objects because we don't need them. They're just noise at this point. So maybe we can shut that whole thing off here in just a second too. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this, right? They are in the same position. Now, if I disconnect this wire, so my Z position is 0, you'll see that it works because, right, instead of these being placed where they're placed now, they're all going to be placed on top of each other at 0. So it'll almost look like there's just one tile. So let's go ahead and run it like this with this mistake in here. Right, okay, so they all have collapsed down. You can see they're still here in my hierarchy, but they all just have the exact same Z position. Right, so I'm initializing all of those. So let's go ahead and put this wire back together, and then let's clean this up because we're done with this section. All right, aren't for loops amazing? If we had done this separately, right, we'd have to have each one of these tiles in here as a separate variable and do all of these steps to each one of them, which would be a mess to look at. But this has cleaned it up immensely. All right, so we've done this. So let's go ahead and hold down Command or Control if you're in Windows, click and drag to make a group. And let's just call this initialize tiles. Now, right, we're only doing the position, but there's also, you could rotate each one of these. There's all sorts of different things you could do. If this was actually like, if you were making a big game that had a bunch of like tiles, you could have, X and Y like we did with those other objects. You could have different textures on each tile and create like kind of an infinitely generated, procedurally generated world. So, right, so we've initialized them. So now we need to start moving them, right? And so that's where we're going to be using our update function. We might end up using fixed update, but to start with, we're going to use our update function. And so what we can do is we can go to one of these tiles, right? Even though we're not using this flow machine anymore, we can actually just select all of this real quick, and we can copy it, and we can go back up to our road tiles and go to the graph that we're working on. And so maybe instead of using update, since I've already got fixed update here, I'll just use that. So I'm going to paste this, I'm going to drag this down, I'm going to delete this tile. Okay, now the issue is, right, if we just ran this right now, what it's going to be doing is it's going to be actually moving the entire road tiles object, right? It's not going to be moving the independent tiles. We're actually going to be moving this entire tile. And so we need to change what we're transforming and how we're doing this. And so the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to grab our list. and bring it down here. Now we could just have a wire connecting down here from our previous list, but it just it's the same list. It just makes it a lot easier visually to not have wires going everywhere. So so we've got our list, but we're going to need to be able to access a unit, because right now if I just was to drag this in here, it's the whole list, and really we want to be able to access each individual member of the list. And so I'm going to need a for loop again, and I'm going to use for each, the same one I used previously. So I'm going to say for each, and then I'm going to go ahead and connect this in as the list. And fixed update's kind of in the wrong place, so I'm just going to scoot this over. I'm going to go ahead and delete that selection. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry, I'm going to right click to delete that link, and it's connect here. And then I need to do the body, right? And so the body is going to be what's connected to generating the new vector. Now, the only other issue is that first I'm going to need my item to be attached here, because I don't want I want it to be adjusting the position or getting the position of this object, not my parent object. And then the other place I need to run this is I need to run it to the over here, right? Because this says self as well, which is which is again the road tiles object, which we don't want to move. We just want to move the individual tile. So I'm going to go ahead and run that line over there. Now, once I've done that, this should, whatever the object speed is, it should update my tile, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and run this, and we should see what happens. Okay, so my tiles are running. And you can see that they are still coming out of sync. And so why is that, right? Now, and you can see I'm also getting some lag here, but that's probably because I have like 8 million different objects on here. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this. You'll see that things are still coming out of sync. So I thought this was going to fix it. We haven't quite fixed it yet. We need to make a couple changes. The first one is to shut off this for loop demo. So I'm going to uncheck that for loop demo there. And that way I don't have all those copies showing up. If you want to make it a little bit more clear and have less things going on, you could also temporarily disable your obstacle generator. I'm going to leave that on for the time being. And I'm going to go back to my road tiles. Okay. So one thing that's happening is this trigger is still active. And so it's so this is where each one of these tiles is being updated by the trigger. So it doesn't matter that they're in the collection. This is still our problematic area. So what I'm going to do is we're going to be actually taking this trigger stuff and moving it over into our other object. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and turn this flow machine off on my trigger. And I'm not going to copy anything over yet, but I just want to disable that so that when I run this, it should just slide through and just go on forever. But I want to make sure that that motion is working, which it looked like it was, but yeah. So, so now it's flying through there, and it's just going to keep going forever. Fantastic. Now, one of the issues, you saw that even though I have, let me go back to the correct graph. Even though I'm doing all of these position updates in the same place, as soon as it hit that trigger and flipped back around, it started getting out of sync. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. But one way that we can help to stop that from happening is if rather than sending this back to, and I don't know where that position is, but it's on the trigger thing, right? So the trigger takes it and sends it back to 50, right? This tile gets shot back over here. Now, instead of sending that back to some arbitrary unit of 50, what I can do is I can set it so that it's 10 units behind the previous tile, right? So I can say, oh, I don't want it to be at 50 units. I want it to be at whatever the center of this tile is plus 10, right? Which is then it's going to be linked to the tile before it. And so, and that will be great. So we're going to make a couple changes to this code to make that happen. Right now, we're grabbing every single item in this list and making changes to it. What we really want to do is we just want to update the position of the first tile using object speed, and then we just want to tie each additional tile to that tile, if that makes sense. We want to use the transform of that first tile to set the position, the relative position of all the other tiles, right? So that it's sort of like they're a train, right? And the first tile is the engine, and it's pulling the train along behind it, right? Rather than each one driving itself and trying to maintain a perfect follow distance. So to do that, we're going to change the type of for loop we're using. I'm actually just going to go ahead and, rather than delete this or replace it, I'm going to right click, I'm going to click add unit. I'm just going to type for, not fought, but for, and I'm going to go to the normal for loop. Because what I want to do is first I want to get only the first item out of this list and do all of this stuff to that first item. Then I want to do something slightly different to every other item in the list. And so to do that, if I click here on this on the output of this tile list and click once, and I go to collections, one of the options here is first item. And so this automatically just grabs the very first item from the list. You'll note there's also one called last item, because oftentimes you want to do something to the first or the last item, and it's a really common thing to do, so that's why they have this. So I'm going to say first item, and there's another thing I can, well, we're not going to worry about that right now. Okay, so I've got my first item, right? And what I want to do is, rather than having all of this connected here and connected over here from this for loop, I'm going to right click here to disable those. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to connect this first item to that, and I'm going to go ahead and connect my first item over here. All right, and so now the first tile is getting adjusted, but nothing else is getting adjusted. And so what I'm doing here is moving some of this stuff around. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and disconnect those two wires, right? Because this for each loop we're going to get rid of. I'm going to go ahead and connect my fixed update right over here for the time being. We're going to actually have to feed it through this for loop in a second, but that's fine. So I've got my fixed update. It's coming down. It's going to create this new vector based on the position of the first item, right? We're going to do some stuff to make sure the speed's accounted for, and then set that position. So let's get this item out. Let's get this out of the way, and I'm going to disconnect from here. And we can just go ahead and delete this at this point. But let's go ahead and make sure that this first item line where we're using fixed update is a little bit separate and cleaned up, so we have some more space down here to do the rest of the work that we need to do. Okay. And I'm going to bring this over here because we want to do all of this, and then we want to enter our for loop and make changes to the rest of the items. So I have this over here. Now I could use this, or I could use another one, but we'll figure that out. Okay, so what I need to do now is, after this first item gets updated, I want to run this into my for loop, right? Because I want to be able to do this to all the other items. And instead of updating all of them the same way, we're just going to take this, we're just going to get the position, the transform of this first item, and then we are going to use that transform to set the other transforms of all the objects. And so with my for loop, there's a little bit of work I'm going to have to setup work I'm going to have to do. So, right, so in this case, right, the first step, we've already set road tile 0, and so we don't need to set that again. So instead of starting at 0, we're going to start at 1. Right? So this means that we're going to start with this tile, and we're still going to go to our last step. Right? The last step, if you remember, should be one more than, it should be the total number of items, right? Which is 7, even though this is item 6. But we want to go to 7. We want to leave the step the same. And then we need to do some work. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to just grab another copy of this to drop into our scene. If I can get it down here. Come on. I don't know why it's being fussy. Maybe I'll just say add unit, and oh, there we go. If I type in the name of the variable, so tile list, I can actually go ahead and get tile list. There we go. I don't know why it wasn't allowing me to drag it over here, but whatever. All right, so I'm going to need my tile list again. And I'm going to need to be able to access whatever different member of that I need. I'm also going to need to be able to grab the first item, so I know I need that. So let's go ahead and create that real quick. And I'm just going to go to collections because it's quick enough to do it this way, and first item. And what am I going to need from the first item, right? I need to get the transform. So I'm going to click twice again. I'm just going to type in transform, and what I want to get in particular is the local position. All right, so I want to get the local position of the first item in the list. And what I want to then do is to set the local position of all the resulting items from the list. And so how do I go about doing that? So I'm going to go ahead and, oops, I did not mean to do that. I'm going to go ahead and click on here. Once I'm going to bring this line up here a little bit, click again. I'm going to go to collections, and I'm going to go to lists. And there's all sorts of different options here, right? And one of those is get list item. So I'm going to select get list item, and then it wants an index value, right? So it wants some value between 0 and 6, which I can grab from this for loop index. So I'm going to run that in there. All right, so this will now grab whatever step I'm on. So it'll start with road tile 1. It's going to grab that. And now that it's grabbed that, what I want to do is I want to be able to set that local transform. So I'm going to write, or I'm going to click again. I'm going to say transform.local p, and I want to set the local position. And then what I want to do is I want to make sure my flow is connected. So I want to go from body to here so that each time through this loop, the local transform of the item I've grabbed is set. And I want to set that transform to this transform, but not exactly, right? Otherwise, they're all going to be stacked on top of each other again, which we don't want. What I want to do is I want to create a new vector 3. So I'm going to click here. And actually, the first thing I want to do is get the z value out of this. So I'm going to just type get, and that should spit up, get z. I'm going to get the z value, and because as always, we're going to need to put that back into a vector 3. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this copy here, and just paste it, drag it over, connect this to the z, and then actually disconnect my flow because I'm actually going to need to generate this vector 3 first, connect the flow, and then make sure I connect this here. Right, so this is going to be updating the z value. Now, in this case, right, what mistake have I made? I just said that we didn't want them all to be in the same z value, but I've connected it. So they'd all be placed on top of each other. What I want to do is I want to make sure that this is set. So I want this to have be 10 units beyond this. So I'm going to click, I'm going to say add and 10. And then I want to feed this in here. Now, some of you may already have noticed that this is not going to work quite like I want it to. And we're going to talk about that here in a bit, but I want to show you what happens. So once it starts to play, now it looks like I only have 2 tiles. So why does it look like I only have 2 tiles? The issue is that I'm grabbing the first item, and then for each tile, each additional tile, they're only being set 10 units behind the first item. So so far it's all right, but the problem is that what I need to do is I actually need the second tile to be attached to the first tile, the third tile to be attached to the second tile, the fourth tile attached to the fifth tile, etc. So how do I fix the problem that I've created for myself? The way that I do that is by doing a little bit more math and using another get item. So what I want to do is I want to get item 0, and I want to set item 1 to item 0 plus 10. Does that make sense? I want to set that transform to, so I want to get this item. I also want to get this item, but what I want to do is I want to get this item and I want to set this item's transform to this item's transform plus 10, right? And then I want to do the same thing over and over and over again. So instead of using this, first item here, what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and delete this option, right? I'm going to go ahead and delete this. What I want to do is I want to say, okay, I'm starting at 1 and I'm going to 6. But what I would like to do is if I wanted to grab object item 0 and use that to set the transform of item 1, I can do some math to this index. I can subtract 1 from this index, and that will give me item 0. And then the next time through the loop, when this value becomes 2, and so I'm grabbing, the third item in here, I can, by using this -1, I can grab the transform of this first one and add 10 to that. So that solves my problem. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to create another line here. I'm going to select this. I'm going to say subtract. I'm going to subtract 1. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this get item. I'm going to copy it and paste it. Put it right, actually pretty close to where I want it. These wires are getting a little crazy, but that's fine. So I want my index to be here, right? So this should be 0 through 5 is what I'm going to get out of this. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull down this so it grabs that item and then connect here, right? So again, what this is doing is it's taking the transform of the first item in the list, adding 10 to it, and setting the transform of the second item in the list to that. Then it takes the second item in the list, it gets that transform, and it sets the transform of the third item in the list to that plus 10. And so on and so forth until it executes all the steps in the loop. So let's see if this works like it should. Okay, so now everything is moving as it should, and it's essentially a train of items rolling down the thing. Now, here comes the trick, right? We've got these items moving through here, but one of the things that we want to do is we want to, if I turn this trigger on, I want this first tile to go move to the back of the train. But what's happening right now is if I was to do that, all these other tiles are attached to the position of that first tile. So when this first tile hits the trigger, the entire train is going to jump back in space, right? And that's not what we want to have happen. What we want is we want to be able to essentially take the engine or the first car in the train, put it and make it the last car in the train, and make the second car in the train the first car in the train. And so then everything's attached to that one, and so on and so forth. So that's what our next step is going to be. But first, take a minute to organize this. This is a total, it's kind of a nightmare, right? It's a big graph. So let's go ahead and just take some time to scrunch it up a little bit so that it's a little bit cleaner, and then group it. And once you've done that, you can pause. I'm going to speed this up a little bit, but you can pause the video and we can do the next step. Okay, so go ahead and group that, and we are going to call this update tile position as our group. Tile positions, because we have multiples. And let's go ahead and color these groups as well. It just makes it so much easier to work on. I don't know why this is. There we go. So I'm going to make green for go because this is the start. And then we will do, I don't know what color update should be, something happy. Let's do teal. Okay. So we're going to initialize the tiles. We've got things so we can update the tile positions. And now we need to figure out what to do when we have the trigger hit. So let's go ahead and make that happen. So the first step we need is we need our event. So I'm going to right click and it's going to be a trigger. So we're going to say on trigger. And I spelled that wrong, and that's making everything fall apart. So on trigger, there we go. And I want on trigger enter. Now the current trigger event is set to be self, right? So that's this empty object road tiles. What we want to do is we want tile trigger to be the trigger we're looking at. And so we haven't really talked about this before, but it's very easy to go ahead and set a different object as the trigger that we're listening to on this object. So let's go ahead and click on this. We're going to go down to wherever tile trigger is. There we go. Close this off. All right. And then we are going to be ready to start going. So what we need to do, and what we're going to do, is one of the nice things about lists is you can reorder lists, right? So what we're going to do is we're actually going to be, when this trigger hits, we're going to pull this item out. We're going to push all of these items up one. So 1 is going to be the first tile, 2 is going to be the next, 3 is going to be next, 4, 5, 6, and then 0 is going to end up where tile 6 is currently. And so then we're just going to keep cycling the order of those tiles. Now, it's a little tricky to do that. And so there's a couple things we need to do. And this was one of the things that, honestly, when I was making this tutorial, made it really challenging. So, I was hoping that I could just use the same variable and, get it to reorder. But what would happen is that it just didn't work at all. So we need another list. It's just going to be a temp list. And so I'm going to go ahead and in this graph, variables, I'm going to go ahead and pull this down. I'm going to just write temp list. And I'm going to create that. And again, I want this to be, it's capital LIST and then game object, right? Is this the type of list that I want? Because, right, lists are, you can only keep one type of object in a list, right? They either all have to be game objects, they all have to be floats or whatever, but they all have to be identical. And so now let's just go to value, and we're just going to make 7 objects. We don't need to set them to anything. They're just going to be set to none by default. So it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so I've created a list, another list that has 7 objects. Now it is really important that these have the same number of items, right? So whatever this temp list has should be the same as your other list. So double check and count to make sure it's the same, or else things are going to go really wrong. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so I've got 7 items. Great. All right, so what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? So the first thing that we need to do is we definitely need both of these lists to be available to us. So let's go ahead and drag our temp list in here. And let's go ahead and drag our road tile list in here. Okay. So step 1 with this process is that we want to be able to grab the first item in the list, right? Because we're definitely going to want to put this item in position 6 at some point. And so I'm going to go ahead and click there and click again, and then just go up to collections and click on first item, right? I don't need to do anything to this first item. I just want to have it available. Okay. So once I've got this first item set or pulled out, the next step is what I'm going to want to do is I want to take items 1 through 6 here, and I want to put them in values 0 through 5 in this temporary list, right? And once I've done that, then I want to take this first tile and I want to plop it back in here in this final position. And once I've done that, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this temporary list and I'm going to set the original list back to what the temporary list is, right? Initially, I was hoping I could do all this work and then set the tile, but order-wise, it just doesn't work that way. We have to have this second thing. So we've got our first item. So then what we need to do is we need to create a for loop. And we can do, we could do for each, but really we don't need to use that last position yet. We're going to do that at the end. So I'm going to click Add Unit, and I am going to go to Control, and I'm going to go down to for loop. Now, again, right now, so up until this point, we've been hard coding these, right? One thing we can do to make sure that if we change the length of our list, like we wanted more or less road tiles, what we can do is we can pull from either one of these lists, and it would probably be best to pull it out of this, the actual list we're using. We can go down here and we can click, and we can go to collections, and we can go to count items. And what that does is it basically just generates a integer value of the total number of items in the list, right? And so in this case, we want this to just go from 0 to 6, right? We want to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 is the last item, which is the 6th item in the list, because, right, this one's the 7th. And so we really want this to be the total count minus 1. So let's go ahead and just do a subtract. And then we can feed that output into last. And so we're going to take this for loop, and what we want to do is we want to insert the 2nd through 7th values of this one into the 1st through 6th values of this one. So I'm going to go ahead and, we need to check for a tag and stuff like that, and we'll do that in a second. That's code we've already written. I just want to get this part together, and then we'll add that in. So before I have any flow running through this, right, we're going to start at 0. We're going to go to 1 less than the total number of items. And so let's go out of our body. So what are we going to do? So the first thing we need to do is we need to say, okay, here's my temp list. This is something that I definitely want to do. What I want to do is I want to get an item, right? So, or actually I want to set an item, sorry. So I want to click over here. I want to go up to collections. I want to go to lists, and I want to set list item. And which item do I want to set? The one I want to set is the index. I just want to, this is a straight even number, right? I want to set the index. But what I want to do is I want to, and I'm just going to copy this and paste it over here so it's a little bit easier and the wires aren't quite so long. and it makes more, you don't have to follow it all over the place. So what I want to do is I want to get this item, but the item that and so I'm going to go ahead and say get item real quick. Lists, get list item. And which item do I want to get? I don't want to get the index, I don't want to get the for loop index. I want the index plus 1, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say, come down here and click. I'm going to go to add. It's already set to 1. So I'm going to go ahead and that's the item I want to get. And so and so I made a mistake here, right? This is a bad mistake it would probably give me an error here, right? Because what I'm doing is I'm taking this list and I'm actually putting that in the item. That's not what I want to do, right? Because that's the item we're going to set in the list. What I want to do is I want to connect this as the list that we're setting the item in, and then the item that it should become is this item. Okay, all right, so I've got my list, and then I'm saying, okay, index is 0. I want to set whatever this empty game object, or this, there's no game objects here, but I want, what I'm saying is I want road tile 1 to be dropped in here, road tile 2 to be dropped in here, 3, 4, 5, and go all the way up. And then when I'm done with this step, this one should still not have a game object in it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and connect my body here. And now I need to set the final item in that list. And the way I'm going to set the final item in that list is I'm going to take the first item, which I have over here. And actually, I could just go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and cut that. So I'm going to hit Command or Control X. And I'm going to go, and then I'm going to paste it over here, Command or Control V. Right? Because what I really want is to, this just, again, it makes it easier to read. Right? That's the only reason I moved this, is I want the first item from the tile list. And I'm going to go ahead and I need to set an item again. So I'm going to go ahead and go copy and paste. And so the question is, right, I want to set, it's going to be the same list. The temp list is going to be what's set. This is going to happen on the exit, right? After all the steps of the loop have gone, it's going to do this one final step, which is to set the final item. So the item that I want to set is the first item. And the place that I want to set it is, we could hard code it, or we could do the thing that we did previously, which is to use count items. Now, count items returns the total number of items. So this will return 7 in our case, right? But the last index that we can access is 6. So what I'm going to need to do is go ahead and I'm going to click on this temp list over here. And I'm using the length of the temp list because, there might be an error somewhere else, but that's fine. So I'm going to click, oops, click the wrong button. I'm going to click, I'm going to go to collections, I'm going to go to lists, and I'm going to go to, oops, actually I'm going to go back, I'm going to go to count items, there we go. And then I need to do subtract 1, right? Because I want to, 6 is the index that I want, not 7. But this just gives me a way, and again, all of this is to set it up so that if we end up with 10 tiles or 12 tiles, this will still work, right? We just want to make sure that that's the same. The only other thing we have to make sure of, right, if you change the number of items in the main list that we're using, the tile list, you want to make sure that the temp list has the exact same number of items, or else all hell's going to break loose. Okay, so this is my exit condition, is to add that one last item. And we have this happening on our trigger, so let's go ahead and make sure our tag is correct and everything is good to go. So, so we need the standard units that we use in here, right? We need to be able to click on this collider and then just do game object compare tag and select that. And then we're going to need a branch as well. And so we can connect this and connect this and connect this to true, right? Because we don't want this happening for any other collisions. And then with the tag, we just need to go and let's see here. The tag is, if I select any one of these tiles, it's roadway. In my case, it's a lowercase r. If you did an uppercase R, then just make sure that this is right, that it is correct. So roadway. Okay, so I've got my roadway. Oh, and the last thing I need to do is make sure that my flow actually connects from the trigger here. Okay, so we're going to see if this works. If everything is going smoothly, this will be totally amazing. Now I want to make sure that my tile trigger, right, this flow machine is unchecked. I want to make sure this is still checkmarked as a tile. And let's see if this functions. And there's a couple ways we can test. And if we're having problems, I'll show you a good way to debug something like this. So I'm going to go, okay, so nothing is happening. Why is nothing happening? Let's go ahead and go back to our road tiles. Oops, wrong graph. Okay, so right, the collider's working. Let's go ahead and stop this and run it one more time to see why we're not getting any action here. And if I come down here to tile list, you'll see that, oh, so right, it was working. Do you see it reordered this, right? Zero's here, but why is nothing else happening? The reason nothing else is happening is because we've forgotten one final important step. That final important step is we now need to, after we've done all of these things, we need to set tile list to temp list, right? So we've updated our temporary list, and that's just holding these values, and then we're going to update the list that we use elsewhere in the game, and then the next time through, the next time it'll continue to go. That's not good language, but that's fine. All right, so let's go ahead and we are going to, we could use this same get variable. I'm just going to go ahead and copy it and paste it again. This is just making it easier to read. And then I'm going to click add unit, and I'm going to say set var, and it'll be set graph variable. And the graph variable I want to set is my tile list. Right, and so I'm just going to feed the output of temp list into tile list, and I'm going to go ahead and connect this over here. Right, so this should be the very last step. If I do it out of order, things are going to go haywire and we're going to miss some things around. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this again and see what happens. Okay, it sort of worked and then it freaked out. So let's see what's going on. Okay, so something crazy happened. It triggered it once and then everything else launched off into space. And so I'm trying to figure out why that happened. So let's go ahead and do something that's a little bit easier to deal with. So we're going to temporarily turn this trigger off. So what we're going to do is we're going to scoot these things out of the way. Now, there's one option that this may need to have a coroutine attached, or this may need to be set as a coroutine because of the for loop, but I don't think so. We don't really want it to be asynchronous. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an on keyboard event. So I'm just going to say on keyboard input. And instead of space, because we might have that set to jump or something else in here, I'm going to use just the letter B. And I'm going to feed this into my branch. And I'm going to disconnect the compare tag. Oh, sorry, I don't even want to feed that into the branch. Oops. Let's go ahead and undo those steps. What I want to do is I want to just feed that into the input of the for loop. So I'm going to disconnect this. So the trigger is still going to be triggering, but this is only going to happen if I press the letter B. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to see what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and play this. And this way we can actually kind of see what's happening in the inspector. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this down a little bit so we can see it a bit more. So if I hit B, oops, I have to click in this window, and then if I hit B, you'll see that the order has updated, right? 1 is in front, 0 is in back. If I hit B again, 2 is in front, oh, and you saw them all fly, but 2 is over here as well. So there's some error in my code where object 1 is not being copied over correctly. So what am I doing wrong? And if I do this again, right, now 3's there, 2's there, and things are going to start going haywire, right? Now this seems to be working, right? It's missing, it just deletes object 1 for some reason. So let's go ahead and stop this and figure out what we've done wrong. Okay, now honestly, what's going wrong is not going to be obvious, unfortunately. All right, so the first thing is things are pretty confusing in terms of like how the wires are run here. So let's fix this, because what I want to do is so this is my exit condition. I'd like all my exit stuff to be up top, right? And so, because it's just going to make it easier to read. So I'm going to pull this up above. I'm going to pull this first item up above. And any math that's happening for this as well is going to come up here, right? Because these are the 4 units plus the temp list over here that we're going to be using. And I'm just going to pull this down so these routes are a little bit easier, right? You can see that graphs get a little bit crazy, and that's part of the reason why groups are really nice, right? It'd be if we could have a group here that's like, this is the body, right? And this is the exit condition. So I've kind of split these apart so they're a little easier to see. So what's happening is that, right, I'm grabbing this first item of the list, and then I'm using it to set this item, and then this is updating. Now, something about the way that Bolt works, when I do this, this item actually gets overwritten and disappears. And so what I need to do is I need to be able to take this item and I need to be able to place it into a different variable temporarily, right? And then I can access that variable and set it to something else. It's just like this intermediary step that needs to happen. And so, when you're working with collections, when you're setting and resetting things, this error can sometimes happen, and I'm not sure. There might be a way that we can adjust that, but I haven't found it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my graph variables. I'm just going to say temp game object, or it could be temp tile, but that's really close to temp tiles. So I'm going to say temp game object, and then I just want the type to be game object. And right now there's nothing in it. But what I want to do is I want to right click and I just want to say set var, and I want to set a graph variable. Oops, and the graph variable that I want to set, sorry, I'm moving this all over the place, is going to be temp game object. And so I want this first item to be what is setting that. And then once I've set that, I need to continue on down the chain of exit conditions. So, right, so this is going to need flow. So I'm going to take my exit, I'm going to bring it in there, and then I'm going to flow into setting the item list. And instead of this first item being what gets set here, I'm actually going to shoot this, pull this through here. Now, hopefully this will work and make everything happy. Let's go ahead and test this out. And again, I know it just seems weird that you can't just go, oh, well, I want the first item in there, and I actually have to save it someplace else, but it's an important step. And this may not even work the way I want it to. I may actually need one more unit in there, but we'll see. Okay, so let's go ahead and play this and see what happens. Now, the thing that's going to happen is, right, the trigger isn't set to work right now. I'm still using the letter B. So what I want to do is I just want to make sure that I can see my variables. I'm going to click over here. I'm going to hit the letter B. And you can see that that switches. I have a 1 here and a 0 there. Round 2, it's still broken. So what is going on? let's go ahead and see if we can continue to fix this. Okay. So I think part of the problem is that when I go to set this, changes have already happened. And it might be good to set this variable earlier in the chain. Right? So I'm going to go ahead and actually reconnect this over here. And I'm going to delete this. And I'm going to hold off on all of these things. Right? I'm going to bring this back down here. But I'm going to delete the line there. And I'm actually going to delete this item line here for the time being. I'm going to select these 2 units. And I'm going to zoom out. And I'm going to pull this over because I want this to happen earlier in the chain of events. Right? Before I do anything in this for loop that may alter what the items are, I'm going to go ahead and do this. So I've got this graph get variable here, and then I go to count items and things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pull this down, grab the first item, and set this variable early in the process. So it's going to be the first thing that I do from my event. And then I'm just going to run through this and connect back here. Now I'm still leaving this on the keyboard so I can do the test and I don't have to watch things spaz out all over up here. So let's see if oh, and then the next thing I need to do is, so I'm setting it there. I'm going to right click over here. I'm going to say get var. I'm going to get a graph variable, and the graph variable I'm going to get is the temp game object. And then I'm going to feed that into my item here for that final item in the list. And let's go ahead and run this, and let's see if it works now. Right. So hopefully, making these mistakes makes this tutorial take longer, but hopefully it also shows you how to debug some of these things. And honestly, like the way I debugged this was just by being like, well, maybe maybe something's wrong. It's setting itself in the wrong place. So let's go ahead and see if this works now. I'm going to click in here so that when I hit the letter B, it updates. Okay, so far so good. Oh, look at that. We actually have a 1, right? So now these are cycling correctly, and that first value is not accidentally being overwritten, right? You all are probably thinking, what a nightmare. And that's what I was thinking when I was trying to develop this tutorial, is what a nightmare, right? So when we're doing something with lists, so when we're working with lists, you want to make sure that if you're doing something like this where you need to rotate the tiles like a chain and they're spinning through, you need to save that first item or whatever item you're going to overwrite into some separate object early in the process before you start looping through your variables and assigning things. Because then it gets ugly. Okay, so I've got all of that set. So now the only change is I'm going to stop this being on keyboard input, and I'm going to go ahead and have this branch come through and set this variable. All right, and this is actually a really a better place to set it, because if I set it right, if I had this set variable earlier in the chain, every single time the trigger was triggered, it would set the variable. But what I really want is only to set this when I absolutely need it, because it's more efficient. I'm asking the computer to do a lot less if it's only when a tile collides with the trigger. Okay, let's see if this works now. I'm really excited for this to function. Okay, so you can see that a couple things have happened. First, right, because we've already set the road speed to object speed, when I'm hitting these different objects, right, my road speed is changing. And on top of that, the tiles are now staying together. There's no gap, right? Everything is linked just as it should be, and it is colliding like it's supposed to. right? This is probably, the most complex graph we will do in one of these tutorials. And, it's something that, right, in this particular instance, or any time you were doing something where, you want your player to stay in one place and you want things to continue to tile, this is an important thing to note, right? So there are several there's a couple endless runner projects that you all are working on. And in any of those cases, this is a really crucial thing to make sure everything stays together. Now, in some endless runners, right, the world just keeps going at the same pace and you either die or you don't die, right? But in our case, we want that to be able to slow down and speed up, which is, a little bit more exciting than otherwise. Okay, so let's go ahead, and the last step is to pause this and clean it up and make sure that it makes sense, and then group it. And so I'm going to go ahead and just tidy this up a touch. So, right, that's all my exit condition steps, and this is everything that's going to happen in the loop. And so I'm trying to keep those somewhat visually separate, and I might actually create a little bit more space, almost like, right, a space between words, because these are different, right? These are two different ideas or two different sections that need to be set up. Okay, so I've got all these objects. I'll pull this down a little bit, and it's time to make a group. And so this group we are going to call what should we call it? So this group we will call Tile Position Reset. And let's go ahead and set that color to something pretty. Oh, yellow. There we go. Great. Okay. So this allows you to this tutorial showed us a lot about how to use for loops, but also collections. And collections, like, we're using it in this case, and you might think, well, what are other cases where I would need a collection? One of the key places is if you have the option to cycle through different items that you want your character to be able to use, or different weapons, like any first-person shooter where you can, switch from weapon to weapon with a single button click, uses a collection of all of those different game objects, and it flips through those, right? And so you can have multiple things there, and then, right, because you use the same fire buttons, but it just exposes that next item in the list, right? And so that's one of the ways that we use collections. And yeah, that's the end of this tutorial.